state your name and your position for the podcast.
Okay, I'm Gerald Jaynes, and officially I'm the A. Whitney Griswold Professor of Economics, African American Studies, and Urban Studies at Yale University.
Welcome. So I was looking at your CV and noting that throughout your career you've both held positions in academia, but also been quite engaged in the public realm. So if we go back to your role as the study director of the Committee on the Status of Black Americans at the National Research Council in 1985 to 1989, just thinking about this current moment where in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, many Americans have been jolted out of a kind of complacence about the state of racial justice in the United States. If you go back to that study in the 1980s, what were some of your findings and recommendations? And then how do you reflect back on that report from the vantage point of today?
Yeah, that's a good question. So now that's a long view. Take a long view. We've had a bunch of time looking at the faces. I don't think anybody was probably born yet when we started working on that. Maybe there were a toddler or two. First, we have to put that study. It's called the book that came out of that study, which involved something like 50, 60 people actually contributing to the overall study over that 4-year period, and a lot of money spent. The book, essentially, you have to situate in terms of Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, which probably was the most influential study of race relations in the United States during the 20th century. And it was published in 1944. And there hadn't been a large-scale study which tried to look at pretty much every kind of question you could think of that connects with two things, the status of African Americans and the status of race relations itself since Myrdal, although there had been obviously some good work done looking at particular kinds of things, like looking at education. The Coleman report of 1966, for example, quality of educational opportunity, that was exclusively looking at education, however. And there had been some things looking at voting rights, politics, and some individual studies looking at business development and labor market change. But no one had comprehensively sat down and said, where are we at this point in time, the mid to late 1980s, 40 years after World War II, with respect to these kinds of questions? Now, I would also say, and I'll preface with this, that at that point in time, it's still, although we were on a cusp, it was still reasonable to put together a group like that and ask that question, thinking in terms of what I call the black-white paradigm, right? Because society still didn't look like it looks like in the United States, like it looks today, or for that matter, like the screen in this class and in most classes now at Yale look. So we were still sitting in a situation where probably, if you said the minority population in the United States, broadly speaking, probably was still 80-some% African American. Now, that was going to change, of course, heading towards where we are now because of the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, which occurred and opened up for the first time broad-scale immigration into the United States of people of color. Right? It was essentially illegal, except under certain kinds of labor contract situations up until that point. It's kind of an amazing thing. So we were still operating under the 1890 federal law that only free white people could become citizens of could immigrate to and become citizens of the United States. So, like I said, we're on this cusp because we'd had about a decade and a half of immigration from people of color who weren't of African descent at that point. And I vowed in the middle of the report, when I started to realize these kinds of things, that I would never again do a substantial piece of work, meaning mainly a book, that was only oriented towards thinking about race relations with Blacks and whites. I'm about to turn that into a lie because there was one additional book I needed to write, which does that. And I'm going to, without mentioning it, talk about it in clandestinely this evening, because some of the questions that I know that Kate's going to ask me, the answers train upon the major theme that I'm working with in the book that I'm trying to write now. Okay, so what did we say? What was the state of race relations in 1989, 1990, and the status of African Americans? Well, obviously, these compared to what? Well, compared to other groups, mainly whites, and compared to 20 years earlier or 40 years earlier. And in particular, compared to the end of the World War II era when Myrdal published his work. And obviously, and we used a pretty standard metaphor, the glass is half full, half empty, because what you found was huge change occurring in most parts of the United States and in most sectors and institutions, and for probably most African Americans. Okay, but there were a lot of institutions, corporations, for example, and areas, certain particularly rural, small city areas in the South and Southwest, where change hadn't been as rapid as it had been in the rest of the country. And there was a core, probably something close to 30% of the Black population who had not really participated in the improvements that have been going on. So, for example, if I had been born 40 years earlier than I was, I'd probably still be a professor because I really kind of like this, love this. But I'd have been teaching at some Black school, historically traditional Black school, probably, right? If I had been born 20 years earlier, I'd be a rich businessman. So that's a big switch, but things that opened up, I probably wouldn't, maybe not have even gone to college. And a cousin of mine and we were going to open up this company in the suburbs of Chicago that was going to basically be one of the early landscaping companies. And we'd have been doing this at a really good time, say the late 60s, early 70s. So I probably would be retired now, but my heirs would have big fleets of trucks and things like that, because I'm sure we would have been pretty successful. But I wouldn't be as happy, although richer. But that is saying something about possibilities and the opportunities that are available. I think that for someone who had been born 20 years earlier than me, there were more opportunities as a business person than there was to try to move into academia. And so it would have been easier to do that for a Black person, a Black male, at those times. So that glass half full, glass half empty was really pretty important. But what it meant, and I'm going to close out my answer to this right now, because I could talk for the next 90 minutes on just that, because you just basically asked me what we find in a 450-page book. So, but what that meant was that, and these are things that we can make relevant today, because I noticed you were talking about George Floyd and the trial that's going on out in Minneapolis when I tuned in. And what's that telling us? And in fact, if we think about that trial, what is the defense doing? The defense is trying to operate on the basis of a set of stereotypes about African American people. And so they're essentially, I don't think it's going to work as well. And I have something to say about that too, because it's got a sort of time horizon change in the white American population's way of looking at things. I don't think it's going to work that essentially they're trying to put George Floyd on trial. But it's not simply that they're trying to put George Floyd on trial. They're also trying to put all the Black witnesses on trial. So what is one of the first things they said in their opening statement? They said that the crowd, and actually if you look at the videos, it's not quite big enough to call a crowd. I actually thought there were more people there before this week when they started showing that. I think that, there might be a dozen people there. I don't quite call that a crowd. And they're certainly not unruly or anything, but they're trying to make it look like there's an angry mob of Black people who the police had to deal with, and they weren't properly able to take care of George Floyd. And also the police could have had reasonable fears for themselves. So they're operating at a high level of stereotype about Blacks there. Those stereotypes, let's magnify them by 1,000-fold in 1990, 30 years ago. And we can multiply them by 5,000-fold if we went back to 1960. But we could put it in every single institution in our society. It really was in 1960 and certainly 1950, apartheid. Wasn't really all that different from being in South Africa. Certainly if you were in Georgia or Alabama or Texas, and only a little bit better if you went to Chicago or other places, because we lived in parallel, separate societies. Okay? Now, what that meant was there's a ceiling on where any Black person what you could rise to, because it was going to be dependent on what was available in terms of opportunities and income levels, say, purchasing power of the Black masses. So that whole idea about linked fate, if you've ever heard that term, all Black people were in a linked fate together, because it wasn't going to be possible for a large number to improve their status without a very large proportion improving their status. Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that's happening in this country right now that we're also starting to understand, all people of color are in a linked fate in this country, as we start to deal with the understanding that vestiges of white supremacy are still operating in this country, unfortunately. And that's something that we're going to have to deal with. Mm-hmm. I think a lot of people's eyes are being awakened. Things aren't quite what they thought they were.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for that. So thinking about the other work that you were doing in New Haven around that same time period, This is just 20 years after that sort of apartheid era. Um, you were working in the city to think about entrepreneurship and minority business development.
Yeah.
How
Well,
how are you approaching that work then? This is part of the work that we're doing now. And so it's interesting to hear about what were the initiatives, what were the success stories, what were the hopes, what was the conversation?
okay, well, that was quite interesting. Because obviously I was actually sitting in my office in the economics department, the phone rings, and it's the mayor's office. And they said that the mayor, who was an Italian American, Biagio Delito, first Italian American mayor of New Haven, because every mayor of New Haven before Mayor Delito had been an Anglo Irish. Or if you go way, way back, straight Anglo British. And the mayor wanted a meeting with me. So we made set up an appointment. I'm wondering what's the mayor want with me. Got to keep in mind, this was 1981 or 82. I was an untenured associate professor, I think. And I was at the time mainly doing work in theory, microeconomic theory. And I had just started working on my first book, which was economic history. So I get there, and he says the Board of Aldermen, they still called it back because it's 1982, right? And it probably was all men too. Maybe it might have been maybe one or two women. Had just created this thing called the Minority Business Development Agency, but they needed somebody to run it. And they didn't have a lot of money for it. So whoever was going to run it was going to be doing it voluntarily because you weren't getting any money. So I said, okay, the mayor's called me. This sounds like something that I can do. So I agreed to do it. Basically, the main money that I did have was I was able to hire an assistant. So that's the person who was going to do all the work. So obviously, it had to be a pretty good person. And then there was a committee that they set up of local people, some different minority business people. I'm trying to remember. I think at that time, there probably was one Latinx member on that advisory committee because the Latinx population was a lot smaller than it is today. And there were no people of Asian descent. And so everybody else was Black, and there was one other white person. And they all had their own agendas, which fortunately I was able to figure out pretty quickly. And I knew right away this is going to be a big problem because we went through hell working out who was going to get hired to be my assistant, who they knew was going to be an important person. So each one of these people on the committee had their person who was going to essentially be a puppet. So I knew I didn't want any of those people. So I actually ended up tricking them because we had to vote. And I had just finished reading, there's a famous paper in economics on voting circularities, essentially. And I knew that the way this committee was composed and who they wanted, that they could never get a majority. So I rigged the way we voted so I could get my person. And it worked. And they never did figure that out, although they were all very unhappy about it. But anyway, so what did we do? Well, our mandate was to provide assistance to minority businesses. It's 1982. They didn't bother to say minority and women, much less minority women and disabled or any other sets of groups. It was strictly minority. And to be frank with you, probably 90% of the older persons, when they voted, probably more than 90%, when you said minority, that just meant Black. So provide assistance for them in helping them improve their businesses, and in particular, improve them so that they could possibly bid for and win city contracts. So that was my first delving into local government contracting in any kind of detailed way. I had had a small taste of that when I was working at the Illinois State Legislature, but I only worked there a year between undergraduate school and grad school. So I didn't learn much there about that. But I learned quite a bit there. And since we didn't have much money, it was going to be very difficult to assist people much. Probably I got assisted better than any minority business because of the low budget. Because the 2 years that I did this, we did help some people. We could steer them to places where we could, so for example, we could help someone who wasn't really ready and prepared to do it to put together a good proposal to go to a bank and try to get a loan. And when some people got loans that I'm sure never would have happened without our aid. But what it did for me was it gave me a obviously hands-on introduction to two things: local city politics and the problems that minority businesses have. And it wasn't all, as they wanted to make it sound like, that they couldn't get loans. Because that's, if you talk to particularly Black business people all the time, that's the first thing: we can't get loans. If we could get, if they were treated, not discriminate against us and give us loans, we'd be okay. We could do better. Well, partly that's true, but it's also not true for other things. Now, you talked about I know you're talking about the supply chain. I want to say something now that is going to follow us along because it's really important. And it speaks mainly to the African American business community. And it has to do with the thinness of experienced, seasoned, small business entrepreneurs. Now, the reason why it's thin in 2021 is quite different from why it was thin in 1980. That gets back to that glass is half full and half empty. Because what the period 1950 to 1980 did was it kind of disemboweled the Black community, in the sense that people who came from better off backgrounds, which I would include myself, but that doesn't mean I was like really better off. But I was better off in the following sense. I didn't live under apartheid because I wasn't from a big city. I was from a very small 99% white town in northern Illinois, where there weren't enough, less than a couple hundred Black people. So there weren't enough of us to give us separate schools if they had wanted to. And so pretty much my entire life, I've been in majority white settings. My parents weren't from Alabama. My mother actually was born in the same town I was. My mother's parents were married there in 1907. My father was born just 70 miles from there, also in Illinois. They were both high school graduates. All my aunts and uncles were high school graduates. This, keep in mind, my childhood is the 1950s and early 60s. The majority of Black born when I was born, late 1940s, backgrounds were rural South. Their parents likely were sharecroppers on a cotton or a tobacco plantation. They literally had third, fourth grade educations, and that just meant they had gone to school for 4 years. They really didn't read or write at a fourth grade level. They were functionally illiterate. And I can say this because some of the people that I grew up with, that's who their parents were. So I know this to be the case. So, and I'm extrapolating now, but keep in mind, this is the post-World 1940 migration of Black people out of the rural South into southern and northern cities. And that's what the majority of them situation looked like. So the next time you might run across a Black person or run across a stereotype, particularly about a Black person, academic achievement or anything like that, I want you to keep in mind, if that person's your age, their grandparents probably couldn't read at all. Their cuisine was probably limited to a half dozen things they could cook. They literally, if they came off the plantation, did not use eating utensils. They ate with their hands and fingers. I'm talking about things I actually saw. So that's why I was relatively much better off. Now, the people who, like me, and there were a lot of those in the South as well, they mostly lived in cities, and there were also Blacks who owned land who were relatively better off, had better schooling. Once the civil rights movement opens up in all the different avenues, politics, education, business, wherever it might be, they were able to take advantage of it. The people who were coming from the situation that I just defined or described, they weren't going to be able to take advantage of it because of deficits in the schooling and opportunities that they had had. It is almost impossible to convey to you how bad race relations were in just the 1950s, and the 1950s were a lot better than the 40s or the 30s. But it was bad. In 1966, when I was 19, I was in the Army, and I went south for the first time in my life. Farthest south I'd ever been before that was the University of Illinois, which is in the center of Illinois. This is basically my dad's hometown area. I went to Mississippi to a small town, and 30 hours later, I was run out by a sheriff. Why? Because I refused to go to the colored people's window at a Dairy Queen. And I was lucky because he told me to get on the next bus, no matter where it was going. He didn't throw me in jail or beat me up. That's life, and that was 1966. So even though we know there was a civil rights movement in 64, a Voting Rights Act in 65, a Fair Housing Act in 68, Brown versus Board of Education said the schools could not be segregated in 54. Well, that's stuff that's on paper. It wasn't actually happening for the most part yet. Okay. So the thin line then was you had this, I don't know, maybe a quarter of the Black population that would be like me or better off. And then you had the rest of it. And so where would a business class come from? Well, it would come from that 25%. And then it would also come from very exceptional individuals who are able to succeed even if their parents were illiterate cotton farmers or tobacco farmers. That's always a big problem because some people will always say, they will always point at an exceptional person like that. And we're going to talk about, like Samuel B. Fuller would be an example of that. Claimed to be during the 1950s and 60s, the richest African-American in the United States. Owner of the Fuller Brush Company, owner of the Pittsburgh Courier, a newspaper out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which was oriented towards the African-American community, and owner of many other things. Truly a man who pulled himself up by his bootstraps, came from nothing. Poor farmer parents in Louisiana. Went to Chicago and starts a business with $25, buys a bunch of brushes. And he and his future wife go door to door selling those brushes. And they make money, they buy some more brushes. Soon they buy $1,000 worth of supply and they keep making money. Soon they start thinking about this and they write up what we today would call a business plan, a network system, and they start hiring salespeople and they branch them out all over the Midwest and then into the South and the West as well. And when I was in the 50s, when I was a kid, we bought stuff from the Fuller Brush Man. But he sold to a lot of people because white people didn't know he was Black. Would have been a problem if a lot of white people would not have bought from him in the 1950s if they had known he was Black. Okay. Now, why did I bring that up? Great, we can talk about Samuel B. Fuller, great Horatio Alger story, African American. But you can't point at someone who is that exceptional and say, why can't the rest of you Black people do that? That'd be like pointing at Muhammad Ali and say, why aren't you all heavyweight champion of the world? Or pointing at the CEO of American Express, I think it's still the same Black person, and saying, why aren't you all CEOs of Fortune 500 companies? There are always going to be these exceptional people. What we want to understand is what's happening to average people, or maybe slightly above average people with respect to entrepreneurial talent, because that's what the real difference is between resources in our various communities. Okay. Typical, a lot of average white people might own a furniture store in a town somewhere. So wealth building becomes a very different kind of thing. Okay. So you have that top-heavy problem. Okay. And then the same sort of thing will operate, of course, if we think about immigrants. Right? If we think about immigration coming out of Korea, South Korea, for example. What do we know about that immigration? Well, one of the things that we know about that immigration Well, Korea, a lot of nepotism and a kind of closed society because of that nepotism. And hopefully it's breaking down somewhat now, but certainly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, when we're getting our largest influx of South Koreans coming into the United States, they are who? What would be a lot of the Korean middle class, talented people. A lot of people who were school teachers, small business owners, people who knew that they were going to be blocked by the underlying nepotism that permeated Korean society and sought opportunity. So this is a very energetic, talented group of individuals who come and infuse the United States with a lot of entrepreneurial energy and now a lot of academic energy as well. So South Korea made a big mistake. Right? Very similar to the United States gaining during just before World War II and right after, because we gained all those German Jews who flee Nazism. And we get that infusion of talent and energy. Okay, so we always have to be careful. That's one of the things about asking a question, and people can always come up with these like sort of simple common sense, why can't you all be Samuel B. Fullers? Or if a South Korean can come and start a cleaning business, why aren't those Black people doing the same thing? But when I talk to a lot of the South Koreans who own businesses that I trade with, and they're not usually high school dropouts. They came to the country with some assets and they invested it. So it's the same thing. They're not living an easy life. Obviously, they're working hard, but they did have a basis of assets, and we're getting the people who are willing to take that risk. God knows I can't see me emigrating out of the country, because that takes a lot of courage. Okay. So 1950s, 60s, 70s, that was the problem for Black entrepreneurs. You're going to have a few people who had been advantaged, who are going to be able to move into better schools and colleges, get better jobs, and there's going to be an even smaller number of exceptionally talented athletically or gifted academically or entrepreneurial or entertainment. But we know, I just named off, all of those are very high talent areas. So it's going to be a small group of those who come out of that mass that are going to be able to be highly successful too. But then you've got the rest. So oftentimes, the business people that I was working with the New Haven Small Business Development Agency, came from that middle bottom group. Okay. Why? Because by 1980, with things opening up, very talented African Americans now have much more opportunities. The people who, if it had been 1950 or 1940, would have been forced to operate in that completely segregated parallel society, now can go into professions, can go work for corporations. And as a consequence, there's a kind of hollowing out now of an entrepreneurial class. Okay. And we're still kind of dealing with that, although it's getting better.
Yeah. So I know we're just going right through time, and it's wonderful to hear you talk about these dynamics, but let's try to capture a few more of the stories. Do you want to go to Earl Graves or to Dave Bing?
Well, Earl Grave, Dave Bing. Earl Grave I knew well. Earl Graves I knew well, the publisher of Black Enterprise magazine. I met him through Yale. They have a thing called a Chubb Fellowship at Yale. And they bring some usually highly successful person, but it could be from any profession. And they come to Yale and they spend 3 days or so. They go to teas at the undergraduate colleges. They might give a little talk about their business if they're a business person like Earl Graves was. He died a couple years ago. And so Earl Graves came, and it must have been like 1979. I'd been on the campus 2 years. That's the same thing. I get a call, but it's from the president's office. Earl Graves is coming. This is a little bit funny. Earl Graves is coming, and we'd like you to be his host. So you can spend a couple days with him, show him around campus, go to all the events where he's supposed to go. And the president asked me, so of course I said yes. But as soon as I hung up the phone, remember, I was a 30-year-old assistant professor of economics working in micro theory. I hung up the phone and I said, who the hell is Earl Graves? I know who he was, and I had never heard of Black Enterprise magazine either. But I found out soon enough. He turned out to be a delightful person. He's another Sam Fuller, right? Exceptional man who was second generation American. His parents were from the Caribbean. He grew up in Brooklyn. Kind of amazing. I was at a meeting with him once, and he started naming off all the people that he had come out of his high school within a 10-year period. And there were just tons. So they all grew up in that same neighborhood of famous African-American people. But Earl Graves had a vision, and he always kept working towards it. A man with probably one of the most organized minds I've ever dealt with, in the sense that he'd get an idea, he'd say, this is what I want to do. I've thought it out. This is how I'm going to do it. And then he was just fixated on getting it done. Right? And that kind of showed me, okay, this is the kind of person it would take to be able to make it to the level that Earl made it, right? So anyway, so I hung out with Earl. I can't help but tell a slight different story that's kind of a footnote to this, but Earl and I hung out, had some fun. About 2 years later, I get another call into my office, but this time it's Earl. Gerry, I'm coming to Yale in a couple of days. I'm bringing my son, who's going to be a freshman in the fall, and he's being recruited by Yale, but his son was an All-American basketball player. So he was being recruited by a lot of people, but he decided he was going to go to the Ivy League. So Harvard and Yale were heavily recruiting him. So the president's office told me, get that kid. So anyway, the funny thing is, so they came. I hung out for a couple of days with Earl Sr. and Earl Jr. We go over to the gymnasium, and the coach tells Earl Jr. to suit up and watch a scrimmage with the Yale team. At the time, I was 32. I was a high school basketball player. And Junior looks at me and says, why don't you suit up too? So I suited up. So I scrimmaged with the Yale team. And here's the funny thing, and I'll let you ask another question. I hit a couple quick 20-footers, And the coach jumps up and says, "Hey, professor, you got any eligibility left?" And so we all start laughing. So of course I like that story.
That's great. I was just looking at, Earl Graves and thinking about the history that you've contextualized for us. And, if he's starting to come into his business career in the 60s and 70s, really 50s, 60s, and 70s, it was interesting to see he's in publishing, he's in radio. And at this time, maybe these are still sort of segregated markets for Black newspapers.
Well, he's operating in segregated markets. That's right.
Yeah.
At that time. And the other important thing about this, Earl started his career, mainly he's a great networker, and he started his career in politics, not as a politician, but working for politicians. He worked for Bobby Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how that operated. Then the same sort of thing. So you can sort of see what's going on here, I hope. Earl's got the Bobby Kennedy, and therefore a lot of New York, because by that time Bobby Kennedy's senator from New York. So that opens up a lot of avenues for Earl during the 60s. So when the time comes and he's ready to make his move into business, he's got those networks. And he's well situated with the Black local politicians in New York City, particularly being a New York City, Brooklyn boy, right? So he's got that network system. You mentioned Dave Bing. Dave Bing, who is a pretty unsung African-American entrepreneur because he owned a steel company, which is not, you don't think a steel company when you think of African-American entrepreneurs. And he owned a steel company way back in the 80s. And how did that happen? Dave Bing played for the basketball for the Detroit Pistons. He was an NBA All-Star. That's his network connection. He was able to utilize that. And when the time came, he was able to get partners and buy a steel company because he had backers. And then also, now I've never met Dave Bing like Earl Graves, but I have to go into this. Kate knows this story, but Dave Bing has come into my life, even though I've not met him, 3 separate times. I think it's only 3. First, when I was in the Army, I was in Vietnam for a year. And in my outfit in Vietnam, we had this guy, David Palmeter, who was from Syracuse, New York. Very good basketball player, David Palmeter was. But Dave Bing went to college at the University of Syracuse. Palmeter loved him some Dave Bing. That's all he talked about all the time. So that was my introduction to Dave Bing. Because Palmeter and I used to always be on opposite teams playing each other. So that turned into a nice sort of battle between us. So, so that's okay. I found out about Dave Bing through Palmeter. But when I went to Washington to be the study director for the Committee on the Status of Black Americans in the 1980s, I was dating a woman from DC. She had a 15-year-old daughter who comes home one day, and I happened to be there with a kid named Alex Bing. Turns out to be Dave Bing's nephew. Dave Bing's from Washington, DC. I'm wrong. There is 4 connections. It wasn't 3. So anyway, so I got to know Dave Bing's nephew, Alex. Very nice kid. Proved of him dating the girlfriend's daughter. A few years later, well, not the same girlfriend, but I got married. Turns out to a Washington, D.C. native, beautiful woman. Turns out she was Dave Bing's girlfriend in junior high school. I said, like, Dave Bing's getting too close to me. And right now, I'll sort of end this story now, but one of my very good friends down in Washington, I have a house in Maryland actually still, and one of my very good friends there was the center on Dave Bing's Washington, D.C. high school basketball team. So anyway, that's my Dave Bing story. But so what's the point? So I want to connect this. I want to make this meaningful for you and for this class, since I meandered off into these stories. There's two good points here. First point, the Earl Graves story and the Dave Bing story. What did I say? I said something that was important about networking and their basis for how they were able to get into business and become very successful. One through political networking, the other through sports networking, which got in, which Dave Bing met a lot of people, the owner of the Detroit Pistons, for example, and other business people in Detroit. That could not happen in 1950 because no white politicians would be hiring any blacks to work for them unless they were, pushing brooms, or maybe they could be their driver. Right? One of my uncles was the driver for the governors of Illinois for about 4 consecutive governors. That, in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, was a great job. Although this uncle of mine was a really superb person who, if he were my age, would probably be a really successful businessman today. But driver for the governor of Illinois was the job he had because of, this would have been somebody born around 1920, or actually a little earlier than that. Okay, so those possibilities wouldn't exist. Yeah. And even the NBA, they didn't get their first black player until 1950-51. So even through sports, you couldn't network like that. Let's not forget, baseball, all those sports, no blacks.
It was really interesting reading about Dave Bing.
I'm sorry, but there's a second point. I want to loop this together.
Yeah.
What's the difference? I want to go back to Sam Fuller and people like Madam C.J. Walker, the first African-American woman millionaire. They operated in that segregated society. They didn't have networks which would take them to the mainstream. So their clientele is the black clientele. And about probably 25, 30 minutes ago, I made the following statement. Entrepreneurial success for a black person back during those days, apartheid, pre-1950, let's say, faded link. If you're going to be a black entrepreneur, your consumer base is going to be black people. They're poor. And they live in the rural areas. So urbanization, those 2 World War migrations, change everything for the black population. All of a sudden, there's 300,000 black people in Harlem, a couple 100,000 in Chicago, 80,000 in Kansas City, 60,000 in Birmingham. All of a sudden now, you've got an urban consumer base and you can start to try to sell them products. You can have black people who maybe own a furniture store, although you're going to have to compete with whites. That'll be a problem, but there's a chance. So if we look at all the business people who come before 1970, they're going to come out of that situation, as opposed to more of what we're seeing today, where you have the opportunity to be able to network across different ethnic lines than simply other Black people. So that was the connection I was trying to make.
I want to make sure we have time to talk with the students. So I just want to make sure we get to the story about the lottery gamblers.
That's important. That's important. And I'll try to wrap this up in a few minutes with just a couple central sentences. The most important African-American owned businesses of the apartheid period aren't in any of the business history books. Zero. Most of the rich Black people, the venture capitalists, the people who are investing in Black businesses that become the top businesses. If you read any kind of history of Black business today, the first thing they're going to tell you is the Black insurance companies. Life insurance for the most part, but other kinds of insurance to some extent as well, but mostly life insurance. Those are the gold standard of Black business pre-1950. And they're all over all the articles in journals and books about Black business. Their revenues were minuscule compared to the revenues that were going into Black illegal lottery operations. Now, there's a moral problem here. I use the word illegal. Technically, they were illegal, but Black people didn't think they were morally wrong. Why? The lottery systems that we see today, all the state lotteries, they're all designed after the private lotteries that were operated by Black entrepreneurs starting in the early 1900s. Okay, and we don't have time, but there were some true entrepreneurial geniuses operating. And what I've discovered, and this is back to this book that I'm working on now, it's not really about business. It's really about Black agency during the 20th century. And its theme is the following, that human beings strive for recognition. And there's two kinds of recognition. What I call public recognition, the affirmation from others that you're a good person, a successful person, but also self-recognition, self-respect, that you in fact are proud of the person you think you are. So that's my running assumption throughout this book. My proposition is throughout most of American history, those two things were in absolute conflict for African Americans. Because in order to have self-respect, you had to fight racism and white supremacy. But if you fought racism and white supremacy, you lost public respect. Okay, you needed to know that to see where I'm going. So when they start operating these lottery businesses all across the country, millions and tens of millions of dollars. And I'll stop with two things. One, I said it was all over the country. Two, many, many women operating at all different levels, from the lowest employees to the top, which are called bankers. Because if you're going to have a lottery, somebody's going to have to pay when there are winners. And the genius to these lotteries, just like the snatch where you pull off something, there's winners every day. So people really get addicted and want to play, right? But all the way to these bankers are women. The last thing I'll say to make my first point about how important they were, well, maybe two things. The first Black company to be listed on the New York Stock Exchange is a company out of Baltimore called Park Sausage. venture capital came from a guy named Little Willie Adams, who was the biggest illegal lottery operator in the Baltimore area during the 50s. He cleaned his money by going into things like that, right? The other thing, I started out talking about these black insurance companies and how they were supposed to be the gold standard. In the state of Michigan in 1955, the largest Black-owned business was an insurance company based in Detroit. That insurance company had been founded by Detroit's biggest lottery banker. And so all through the 20s, 30s, 40s, into the 50s, many of the successful Black businesses that we are seeing are getting their funds out of from these lotteries. Okay. And the same kind of thing that has been going on with the double standard in drug laws, right? So we know cocaine laws, if you got powdered cocaine, you get a light sentence. But if you got crack cocaine, you get these mandatory horrible sentences. And we know that that's Black people on the one hand and mostly white people on the other hand. Same thing was going on with lottery. Why? Lottery is just gambling. Lottery, which was mainly operated by Blacks, was illegal, but all kinds of other forms of gambling weren't. And then, of course, it gets muckied up even more when the states in the 1960s and 70s start to take over the lottery themselves. So I'll end there.
That sounds like a very fascinating history.
Is highly commodifiable. Mm-hmm. So there's no sense in fighting that, as some people try to do. You should look at it and then figure out how you can make it work for you. Okay. So, for example, I always kind of laugh when I read comments like the following. I just read something actually yesterday. There was a complaint about, white people wearing dashikis. You know what dashikis are? Dashikis are a kind of African dress. It's just basically a very loose-fitting shirt that has a hole in the top that you pull over and you wear it, right? And it's African. It's African wear. And during the 60s and 70s, when Black people started to get their race consciousness, we started wearing dashikis. Because before that, and I didn't get into other things, Black Americans were ashamed of Africa. And I won't get into why, but mainly it comes from the fact that white America debunked Africa, so Black people didn't want to be associated with it, right? So Black people were wearing dashikis in the 60s and 70s and afros. And so this person's complaining, white people are wearing dashikis. They're taking over our culture. Or a white person maybe covers a song that a Black person had a hit with 10 years earlier, and some Black people get angry. I say, why get angry? Here's the problem. If you come from, I don't know, I'll pick on somewhere, I don't know, Chile, and you start a business, and maybe a lot of businesses start around some concept which is well known in Chile. There aren't a whole lot of Americans who can appropriate that because we don't know very much about Chile, right? So now you can say the same thing's going to happen. We don't see a whole lot of European Americans, although I have seen a couple, operating Chinese restaurants, right? Or operating Thai restaurants because they don't have the capital for that. But on the other hand, African Americans been in the country for 400 plus years. Anything we do, there's a whole lot of white people that know all about it. So when we attempt to do racial capitalism in the way you just said, we're going to have more competition from whites. And I would say that if we go back to that pre-1950 or 1960 period where we're talking about where we've got that separation, apartheid, and we've got this really pretty dismal entrepreneurial performance of African Americans, one of the important reasons for that is white competition. That half empty part of the glass, maybe might even be 2/3 full and only a third empty. And but it's really bad for the third. It's worse for the third than it might have even been 20 years ago, 25 years ago. But there's an interconnectivity there. That's because it's worse for the bottom 30, 40% of the whole United States. And that's leading to a lot of the problems that we're witnessing. What's my take today? Well, we don't have to be a genius today and have spent a lot of time thinking about race relations, and particularly race relations as they occur in this country, to understand that the country's changing. I always like to say it this way. The first class I ever taught at Yale, 1977, was an intermediate macroeconomics course for undergraduates, 40 students, 36 of them were white, one black, a Native American, and a couple of Latinx students. I don't think there were any people of Asian descent in that class. So that's where we've come from. Because now that class would be at most half white. But there are people, especially older people, but not all older people, who grew up before the 50s and during the 50s and 60s, who remember wherever they went, whatever the institution might be, it looked like that first macro class I taught. And whoever was running things was always white people, and usually white men. And that's what they were comfortable with and used to. Some people can't adapt to change. So we're getting this backlash. And in one sense, it's worse than we even, I knew there were a lot of white supremacists in the United States, but the last 5 years or so have shown even more than I thought. And we really are at a dangerous period. I don't think you need me to tell you this, but we are at a very dangerous period simply because of that. We got to get over that period. If we get over this period, we're going to go back to we're going to enter a new golden age for the United States. A golden age where our heterogeneity of peoples is going to really make sense. See, I can talk like this because I knew when I was in junior high school, I would sit back and I would think, and I'd look around me, I'd be sitting in a class, be 35 students, and I'd be the one person of color. This is all my classes, all the way from kindergarten to college. And I would say I can't think in terms of being Black-centric. Because my dream would be we'd get past this, and I have no idea, thinking then, like when I was 12, 13, what my grandchildren might look like. And I'll tell you right now, all of my nieces, nephews, great nieces, nephews. We're married to everything you can think of. So my extended kin family, we really look like America. And the rest of us are going to have to get that way too. That's really going to be the only, but I think that may happen if we make it through these next, I don't know, 5 to 10 years. It's not a done deal though.
Well, that on that image, maybe that's a good place to stop, and to leave it with that vision of where the golden age that we could be heading into with much luck and hard work. Right.
Right. We all have to play our part.
That's right. Well, we want to thank you so much for being with us, Professor Jaynes, and appreciate the time that you spent with us and sharing your insights and your stories, and the stories of some of these extraordinary entrepreneurs that you've shared as well.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it, and thanks for the good questions.